I feel like I can be the next big boss of the world, so to speak, right? I can feel that position. And so obviously the Americans have put up huge pressure on the South China Sea. So the Americans, by the way, they have bases, as you know, in Guam. There's a big military influence in Guam. There's also a big base in Japanese on the eastern side of China. There is also in Philippines now. There is one there, and then in Hawaii and other areas as well in Australia. So the Americas kind of cordoned off the Chinese in a way through their, and also South Korea. Sorry, let me not forget South Korea. The America has a very big base and a huge military presence in South Korea. So basically, China feels like it's being threatened, and so kind of I feel like in a way of kind of retaliation, China wants to control this very important bottleneck part of the world, which is the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and that's why it's got a huge base, and spent a huge amount of money building that and kind of bullying America out of it to the point where America is just like, you know what, we don't want to be here. It's not really that great, anyways, right? And you know it. You've been there. You said it. It's hot. It's dry. There's not really much in Djibouti. Somaliland, there's a lot there, by the way. A lot of architecture, a lot of history, a lot of things as well, and also Berbera, this important deep sea port in Berbera, which many ships conduct. And that's why the Emiratis, the United Arab Emirates, have invested almost $500 million in at least the first phase, and they've also invested $1 billion in Ethiopia for the for the Berbera corridor to go through to Ethiopia, to Addis Ababa and sub-Saharan Africa. So will the Chinese try and pressure? Yes, because that's an important part, and that's why the Americans created this Quad alliance in the the Indian Ocean with Australia, Indonesia, I think it is, Japan, and I forget the other fourth country anyway. So it's created this Quad alliance in that region as well to kind of further isolate China and kind of like, because that's where the next battle is. The next battle is in the South China Sea. And so China, that's why it's forging its relationships. And that's why today it did this historic thing with the Saudis and the Iranians just yesterday in Beijing, signing this trilateral agreement. So China is really winning the war. Unfortunately, Biden administration is not doing too good. It's failing, and it's failing us as well as Somalilanders, to be fair. Although things are very slow diplomatically and things of that nature, the US has created a US envoy for the Horn of Africa. They have a guy by the name of Michael Hammer, who's an envoy in the Horn of Africa now, but not much in the way of presence and relationship with Somaliland. So a lot needs to be done on both sides, to be fair. Somaliland needs to kind of reach out, and it's not only just, it's a two-sided relationship. It's a bilateral relationship. So we know what the Americans want, but we need to kind of tell the Americans, listen, this is what we need. And not only just the Americans what we need, but also it's the right thing to do as well. That Somaliland, a country that has existed, should get its independence, right? Even if there wasn't this Chinese incursion, purely for regional stability and peace in the Horn of Africa, because lack of Somaliland recognition is kind of handicapping Somaliland and really causing a huge, and that's what's going to cause the spread of this Al-Qaeda from Somalia and ISIS and other nefarious groups to kind of expand. And as I already said to you, the Horn of Africa, according to multiple UN reports, annual reports that are written about piracy and terrorism, and also from the US State Department, even the most recently, they named Bosaso, northern Somalia, as the entry point for Al-Shabaab weapons, illicit trade, and counterfeit goods. And it comes, by the way, through the location of Iran, through Yemen, to Somalia, just across the border through, yeah? So that's that. So yeah, the answer is the Chinese, yes, could potentially, in retaliation, apply pressure if it kind of annexes and secures unilateral power of that location. Now that it's signed this deal with the thing, that's what it's looking to do. Given that the US is kind of applying the pressure closer to home with some of its partner countries like South Korea, Japan, Guam, and Philippines, and now they're looking to side with, hopefully in the future, with Vietnam as well. So yeah, I think that kind of answers your question, both of your questions.
Appreciate it, Abdul. I want to do, let's see, I want to take, let's see what I want to do. Let's see, 20, 25 minutes maybe for questions. And we can open that up. If we have to go longer, that's fine. But I do have some people now sending me a request. Let's go to the first person, Adin Ali. Adin Ali, go ahead with your questions for Abdul. Aiden Ali, go ahead with your question.
Hey, Michael, I want to ask you a quick question real quick, okay?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, you from the United States, correct? And the United States,
Yes, correct.
and the United States is united. Why are you in a podcast spreading propaganda?
I want to answer your. I'm hosting a show called Flashpoint
So why you
Geopolitics
wanna
that takes from many
the
different.
thing I want to understand is Somali people, right? Somaliland want to have their like independence, but your country is peace united, but you here want to divide two a country that's one people, one race. You know what I'm saying?
My goal is not to divide. My goal is to hear different perspectives. So, are you from the Somalia part of the country, the southern part?
I'm from Somalia.
Originally,
I'm from Somalia.
So what is the perspective from your side on the status of Somaliland as it currently exists? You liken it more to a state, like a United States state, that's top-down federal control over the
Correct.
region. Is that how you view
What's
it?
better than unity? You feel me?
But don't you think it would be? Let me have Abdul respond back to that, because you guys are living in the region. I don't want to interject from the U.S. perspective, but I want to have Abdul respond to the interesting fact that you have there, the status of Somalia question. Go ahead, Abdul.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Adam, as well. So basically, what Adam is talking about is this kind of very archaic, monolithic idea. It's a very fascist ideology of ethno-nationalism, right? Building a country based on ethnicity. So as I rightfully said to you, Somalis live in not only Somaliland, they live in Somalia. Somalis also live in Djibouti, at least people that speak Somali. They also live in Kenya, at least in the northern part that shares a border with Somalia. In the south, and also in Ethiopia, in the eastern part of Ethiopia, right? So Somalis are scattered all over the country. What people like Aden and other people that have this ideology, this very dangerous and divisive ideology of ethno-nationalism, it basically seeks to say that we should form countries not based on colonial boundaries that we inherited, right? Which is what all countries in the African Union and countries that were colonized, they subscribe to, right? So the OAU, set a charter in 1964 upon the formation of the OAU in Cairo that for there not to be violence and spillovers of, conflicts and unending conflicts resulting in deaths and millions of deaths, at least in Africa, member states came up with the agreement. And Somaliland was there, by the way. We were in that agreement because we predate the existence of the OAU charter and the OAU meeting. So what Aden elicited to is this very fanciful and very naive idea of like forming a country. And so what he's talking about is not only a country about Somalia and Somaliland, but a country where Somalia and Somaliland annex Djibouti. They annex Ethiopia, at least the eastern part of Ethiopia, which is a large part of the territory of the eastern part of Ethiopia. Right, it's almost like a quarter of Ethiopian territory, maybe a bit more, a third of the country, like a huge, large swathe. Ethiopia, and northern Kenya, and that wouldn't work. You can't form a country today based on ethno-nationalism. It's a very fascist ideology, and it's a dangerous ideology. And so when someone asks you that, Michael, the simple response that you say to them is, well, do you have a one country called the Arab country in the Middle East with all Arab-speaking people? No, you don't, right? You have Yemen, which you know about. You've been there. In fact, Yemen is even divided. You have South Yemen and North Yemen. In fact, some of the conflict that is happening today is through the union between North and South Yemen that united in 91, right? They share very different cultures, by the way. South Yemen, the port of Aden, right? The port of Aden, we have a rich history that relates with us. A lot of Somalilanders lived in Yemen, at least in that southern part, and a lot of Yemeni people lived in Somaliland and in Djibouti and other places. We have a rich history, right? So it's fascinating. So basically, what our young friend Aden was alluding to was forming countries on the basis of ethno-nationalism, that we should have one country, so not just Saudi Arabia but all Saudi, Yemen, Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, Iraq, Jordan, where that ends, right? So in Europe we have 3 speaking German countries. No one says, oh, by the way, the Germanic people are split, we need to form a country for one greater Germany. No, that's fascism. It's ethno-fascism, right? And we are seeing that play out today, by the way, the remnants of that in Europe, in Russia,
In
and Russia is
Ukraine.
using this in Ukraine. So Russia is using this idea that because Ukraine used to be part of the former Soviet Union, that and you know they speak Russian in the eastern part of the country and very close ethnically and whatever. That Russia obviously is annexing Ukraine, whatever. But we know what the story is, so I don't want to go into it. So yeah, the story is it's based on this ethno-fascist ideology. It's a very dangerous ideology, and if that can of worms is allowed to open, it will end nowhere. We'll have like Arab countries and other people that will just be annexing each other, and we'll have unending conflicts similar to what we are seeing. And that's what we are having the problems at the moment in the Horn of Africa, where Somalia does not want to. And the thing with Somalia, by the way, it doesn't have a country in the sense of it never got its independence because it was a UN administered trusteeship, and it doesn't meet the four conditions of statehood that every country in the world meets. And one of the conditions that it does not meet, and an important condition, is territorial boundary. Somalia does not have a territorial integrity, because if you look at the boundary between Ethiopia and Somaliland on the maps, you will see that it's a dotted line. Why is that? It's not a demarcated border. That border between Ethiopia and Somalia, or Italian Somalia, was never demarcated, because Somalia was part of Ethiopia once upon a time. It was part of Greater Ethiopia, right? Whereas British Somaliland has demarcated borders that go back as far as 1884. And we've had subsequent treaties with the Anglo-French, the Anglo-Italian, and the Anglo-Ethiopian treaties before the turn of the last century. So the boundaries and the things we fall in line with the thing. So again, by the way, my family, a lot of my family and my heritage, they live in Djibouti, right? The Issaaq clan is a clan that lives in Djibouti. Some of my grandparents and families live in Djibouti. Similarly, some of my other family members live on the other side of the Somaliland-Ethiopian border. I don't go around saying, "Oh, I'm going to go and annex that because it's my territory and we are the same people," because that's ethno-nationalism. It's a fascist ideology, very problematic. It's not sane way of doing things, and so this idea of it's part of this greater project, what we know as Somali Wayne. In Somalia, it's known as Somali Wayne, which translates to Greater Somalia. Bit like the Hitler idea of Greater German people or the Greater Aryan-speaking people, or the Greater Russian Soviet people as well. So it's a very dangerous ideology. Just because we are Somalis does not mean we have to have a country. We can respect each other's boundaries. I live in thing. I don't go to Djibouti and say because my grandparents lived there and once upon a time, there was the empire. We don't say that. No, we don't say that. It's once upon a time Yemen, parts of Yemen ports, right, in the 1800s. Right, parts of the Yemen, I think, we used to fall under the Djibouti, Somaliland, and Yemen ports in Yemen, Mocha, the famous place Mocha, and other places fell under Somaliland territory, the Sultanates, right? But we don't claim that today. Yemen is Yemen, even though I have some family members that live there and live in Djibouti, right? So it's a very dangerous ideology. It will ethno-nationalism. It's not something we do, and the African member states of the African Union and the international community dissuade against this idea. And that's why, but we have this problem, by the way, in the Horn of Africa with Somalia, because Somalia is not living at peace with its neighboring countries. It's at war with its country in Kenya because it claims the territory of the northern Kenya, the NFD region, says, no, that's part of my territory because they are Somali people. Yeah, they're Somali people, but it's not part of your territory. Kenya is a demarcated border with a country that got its independence in 1964. All right. Same with Ethiopia. There are Somalis that live in the Horn of Africa. Right, in Ethiopia, in the eastern part of Ethiopia. Doesn't mean, they're Ethiopian citizens. They're ethnically Somali or whatever, Somali-speaking folks, but they're Ethiopian citizens, right? And so there's this confusion that erodes the lines between, at least in today's modern states, concepts of states and what a nation is, this idea of, nationalism and ethnicity and the blurring of the lines, and the very problematic statement if we went down that route. Because in Europe, we would have another conflict now, where the three Germanic-speaking countries will say, listen, we want to break away and form a greater German, speaking country, and we can't do that. That would not work. So I don't know if that made sense, Michael.
No, it did. And, to a certain extent, there's two different ideas. There's the idea of the world going forward as countries unite and become more, sovereign. I have an idea, and I'm sure others do, and maybe ultimately, I think this is maybe several centuries out, of a greater African federation, similar to the United States of America. But I don't think that would work just yet. Ideally, right now, and it's unfortunate given that the amount of, and I think it's innate to the human primal nature, conflict. I think ultimately, though, in the short term or for the foreseeable future, we'll have to work out nations, at least in some regions of the world, as it relates to smaller regional territorial nation states. And you look at the breakup of Europe after the Cold War, particularly, and you look at the Balkans, the breakup of Yugoslavia, and you see, yes, that has led to recent spates of strife, but it's also led to stability. If that nation state was held together, by hook or crook, it would have had ultimately, I think, for the last 30 years, scores of endless conflict. And so, sadly, yes, sometimes it's better to break up and form smaller countries, and maybe seek a reunion of sorts, be a resolution down the line, which may take a couple decades. It may take a century or longer, but ultimately, the prevention of conflict and the prevention of regional strife and a recurrence of genocide in this particular instance is something that I think we should go for, the prevention of it and not the reoccurrence of it. And so, again, there's two different formulations, and we're seeing that now. Ethno-empire, if you will, to coin a phrase, or maybe that's out and it's been around for a while. You see that through the eyes of Vladimir Putin and revanchist theories of returning all former Soviet republics to a sphere of influence. Ultimately, and a lot of people get this wrong, he doesn't want a return of the USSR. He wants a return of the Russian Empire that predated it. And so we saw that with with Hitler before Putin, and we saw it with other leaders, Napoleon, French greatness throughout the continent, continental France. Didn't work out too well for him. And I was going to let her, I think it was her, speak again, but it looks like she stepped off.
Just before you let them speak, Michael, Ada, by the way, I can share in the tweet. He's on his timeline. I was just scrolling through. He's put Somaliland Genocide Part 2 coming. So this is the kind of mentality of the type of people that we deal with. So when you say, like, we may unite with them, we may never unite with these people. Like I said, historically, culturally, linguistically, morally, we are very different. Just because we speak a language doesn't mean that we are binded together by lingua, language of communication. We are united by more than that. And these are people that are supposed to be Muslims and Somalis, and they speak the same language. And our friend here, Aiden, just saw in his timeline calling for a Somaliland Genocide Part 2. Thank God at the moment there's a UN arms embargo in Somalia for obvious reasons. But we know that if the arms embargo would be lifted on Somalia, that the first place that Somalia would want to use it is to kind of use it on Somaliland once again, to kind of finish off the job that, Siad Barre, because these people that call for this ethno-nationalist ideology from Somalia, or these Somalis, are people that exist from a certain clan, and they have this kind of desire and this hand to kind of, control all of the Somali-speaking territories in the Horn of Africa under their kind of stewardship, and they're known as the Darod clans. And that's what we are suffering. A lot of the instability that is happening in the Horn of Africa is through this Darod clan, the political Darodism, which is kind of calling for, again, there's no such thing, because the Darods have never ruled, and they've never ruled the region or ruled other Somalis. But ever since 1960, at least 1969, with the Siad Barre, who was a Darod, and who had prominent members of his clan and other sub-clans of the Darod sub-clan, created this thing called the MOD Alliance, the Marehan, Ogaden, and Dulbahante. And this guy clearly comes from those tribes, because on his timeline, and I just shared with you, and I can put it up in the top, he's calling for a genocide Part 2. So we really can't take these people seriously. We know who these people are. They are, very similar to, these are people that have not been de-radicalized. They're fascist. That's why they have this desire for this ethno-nationalist ideology. It does not come from a place of goodness and heart and brotherly and union, but rather more from a place of subjugation and force. But Somaliland has never been subjugated and forced by, these people, you know what I mean? And they're kind of still hurting how 3,000 SNM members, Somali National Movement members, was able to overthrow the then third largest, strongest army in Africa at the time, after Egypt and South Africa. 3,000 men, right, and women were able to destroy, these guys, Siad Barre regime that was tooled up with some of the most sophisticated Soviet and then US-made weapons at the time. And so that's what these guys want. And they think that they can force Somalilanders, specifically the Isaaq clan, who they committed the genocide against. Because when we talk about Somaliland, we really, although there are other clans that live there, really though, the majority clan is the Isaaqs. So if Somaliland is to exist, it exists through the will of the Isaks and things of that nature. So that's what Aiden is referring to, and when he's talking about ethno-nationalism, he's calling for a genocide part two. So he's not serious, but these are the type of people we deal with. And so these are not people, Michael, that we want to ever have a union with just because we speak the same language, because we don't have same culture, we don't have the same history. These are people that take my history and then reappropriate my history, my culture. In fact, northern Somalia, they've taken wrongfully a name for the provinces, because Somalia is now split into 5 little provinces, and each province has its own president and vice president and army, which is crazy. And so in the northern part of Somalia, that's on the border with Somalia, they call it Puntland, right? And why is that? Because the land of Punts, and they don't have any history relation to that historical ancient empire or the ancient land of Punt, that very ancient civilization. They have no recollection because it didn't concern them. But the other reason that they took the name Puntland was because in 97 they wanted to undermine Somaliland, and so they came up with the land of Puntland. So not only did they steal my name, right, but they also were trying to to confuse the international community. Say, listen, Puntland, Somaliland, we're all the same, but we're not the same. We're not the country. We are not the South, and they're not the North, and or vice versa, right? We are officially a country. Whether we're recognized is a different point. Normally, these guys, their talking point is, "Oh, you don't have a seat in the UN," and blah blah blah. Well, so did Switzerland. Switzerland didn't join the UN until 2002 or 3. Didn't mean Switzerland was a sovereign country. Switzerland was a country by all intents and purposes of the world, right? A peaceful country in Europe. So a member status, in fact, the seat that Somalia currently sits on, the federal government of Somalia, is my seat. It's the seat of the British Somaliland, and so Somalia will be taken to court for 2 things: for the misappropriation and the illegal theft of my documents and my history and cultural appropriation, but also for the Isaac genocide that they committed in the 80s. And so, yeah, these are not people that we would ever form a union with, Michael, because, like I said, they are very fascist ideology, these people, and they've not been de-radicalized like the Germans, who went through a course of de-radicalization after the Second World War. These Somalis, by the way, ever since their last 30 years, they've just gone from piracy, terrorism, civil unrest, civil wars, Islamic courts, instability now, even as a government. The government doesn't even control beyond 4 square kilometers of the Mogadishu. Literally, outside of that, it's a free-for-all. The Al-Shabaab run taxes, and they are more. They get government, and they have paid members in the politics as well. So yeah, Somalia is officially a failed state, and it's and the future for Somalia is that it will be broken up and go through a process of balkanization, similar to Yugoslavia, what happened in Europe, and it will be broken up into the different regions. So I'm sorry to tell Aiden and other people that have this idea of this, Soviet revanchism, or we can call Somali revanchism, but there's no such thing as Somali revanchism, right? Because there was no such thing as a greater union of Somali people. We've never had that union. You know what I mean? So just thought I'd throw that in there, Michael.
Got it. Thanks. And let me open it up for another speaker. I saw I had Dr. Miriam. Is she wanted to come back on? And just so you know, everybody, if you come on and you want to espouse like that comment, I haven't seen that comment yet, but I'll make sure I hide it. If you want to espouse thoughts of genocide or other things of violence, you will not be allowed to speak. You'll be removed from the show, and you may or may not be blocked depending on how I feel at the current moment and the topic that you bring to light. So we want to have a civil engagement here today. We want to have civil discourse. We do not want to have I recognize that there's a deep-seated history of clan rivalries and tribal things, and that's fine. That's part of history, but I don't want to have it out in the show. I want peaceful discourse to rule the show here today, and maybe we can just have a little bit of progress if that's capable, even in some small venue like Twitter Spaces. Maybe it's possible to put forth a little bit of progress on the relationship between Somalia and the Republic of Somaliland. Maybe that could happen, maybe not, but we'll see. So the next person to speak, just go ahead and send me requests, and after you get added, just raise your hand. If you do, I see somebody, just so you know, I see a couple people have requested then dropped off. That's not because I'm ignoring you, it's because we have somebody else currently speaking. So if you do want to speak and there's somebody else speaking, just go ahead, send me that request, but just wait, and then I'll get to you after the person that's speaking has finished up. One going to scroll through and see if I can get the name of the person who was requesting before. She may have dropped off the call. I think she may have dropped off the call. If there's anybody else that wants to send, oh, wait a minute. Miriam Dahir, Dr. Dahir, if you wanted to ask a question of Abdul, please go ahead and send me a request. I see that you're on the space, and I'll let you speak. In the meantime, I have Mohammed Kiare. Mohammed, go ahead with your question.
If we can also, Michael, I don't know how long we got. If they don't have any questions, a lot of you could also just ask them if you want to leave a comment or something that they want to say, depending on the time as well. That's also fine. A lot of the people here are Somalilanders. But yeah, if anybody's got, I think if that's fine with you, any comments or something that they want to share with you, or something that they want to say, I think we should,
Absolutely. No, that works out. Mohammed, please go ahead with your question. Mohammed Karir, can you go ahead with your question? You're now a speaker. If not, if you can't hear us, just try to work out the technical glitches on your end. Somaliland, Abdul 2242153. Go ahead with your question or comment for Abdul or myself. Please go ahead.
I have a comment to make.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So I'm a Somalilander. I'm born in London and I'm 16 years old. I'm currently living in New York City going high school. My dad served in the United States military and has deployed to many countries around the world. He is the founder of Somaliland Online, and after reading the history of Somaliland, I realized that Somaliland was British protected and was recognized by the United Nations and 35 other countries, including Israel. On the other hand, after my father and I researched the history of Somalia, we realized that it has never been recognized by other countries. After the war between Somalia and Somalia, Somaliland got their independence back in 1990, and they have been in peace and stability for the last 32 years, while the next door neighbors have been in chaos and war with their own country. They've never had their own election. Why do you think the United States blindsided not to see Somaliland establishing and fulfilling their destiny for peace, democracy, and stability, while the international community is giving billions of dollars to a failed state named Somalia? Why do you think a young adult like me, who grew up in a civilized country, will want chaos and terrorism in a country like Somalia?
It's a great question, and thank you again for joining the show. Somebody as young as yourself, 16, is really doing a great service to research and be a part of this issue and learn more about the country and the region at large. And so I applaud you for coming on the show to ask the question. I'll start first. I think the United States is somewhat behind the curve. As somebody who's been a part of the military and worked for a contractor and other things, I'm currently out of that now. I'm doing something else to take a break from that for at least a few years. There really is no one set, formulation or agency that makes all the decisions, and different presidential administrations have different value sets or different outlooks on regional geopolitics or world geopolitics from a system at large. And so I think what has happened is after the 1990s and our engagement with Somalia under President Clinton, we said, we're not doing that again. It's just a bloody mess, but we want to recognize Somalia, which we've done, and deal with it as a whole. And honestly, what we should have done is recognize that there's a continuing problem and have recognized Somaliland. That's my view. We should have recognized them and dealt with the two different nation states accordingly. We haven't done that because I think there's some in the Department of State, the State Department here in the United States, that don't want to have, if you will, a kind of Russian style, picking part of a nation and breaking it up and recognizing only a little bit of it and maybe a little bit of another. And we don't want to get into the weeds of what was called in the 1800s the Great Game. However, as a part and parcel of new great power competition between Russia and China, that new Great Game, if you will, although it's not dealing with colonies in the old sense, it's more of economic partnerships and bases. It's on us again. It's here. It's now. And so I think it would behoove us as a nation to actually go ahead and recognize Somaliland, um, and establish a partnership and full diplomatic relations and exchange of ambassadors with the region and hopefully nation state. So, with that said, I want to turn it over to Abdul to get a little bit more into it from the Somaliland side because he can provide a lot more than I can. But to your question, I think we're just behind the curve on it. Maybe there's some people in the DOS that think that we can bridge the gaps and have all areas of Somalia and Somaliland bridged together in a union, but I don't see that happening for the foreseeable future. Abdul, do you want to go ahead and take Somalia's question?
Yeah, no, I just want to say a big thank you to young Somaliland, Abdul 224. Thank you for that. You're a bright young man and an asset to your country. As a 16-year-old, you probably never been back to your country, or you probably have, and you're an asset to know about your country because, you know, what the Isaac genocide did and the displacement of Somalilanders, right? And that's a dark history in Somaliland's history. Meant that there is a whole generation that is born 30 years, in the last 30 years, a whole generation born that don't know anything really about their history and their culture and their illustrious, and that's a problem with us. I mean, I was born after the genocide as well, and it's just like we don't really know much, and this is something that I had to learn myself. I had to go and research. I had to go and read. It wasn't something even my parents taught me about this Isank genocide and the bloody history, but these are important truths that as a young man or woman to know about where you come from. And it's important to know where you come from so that you know who you are as a person, your place in this world, but then also to kind of carve out your future and to leave your destiny and your legacy, And so knowing that means that you can do that very adequately, but not knowing your history and your past and where you came from, all the good and the bad aspects of the history, because not everything is rosy, right? So it's same for Somalilanders. We have negative parts of our history, just like every other country in the world as well. So yeah, it's very important. Just a couple of points I just want to mention, Michael. I think you answered that point quite well. Just wanted to remind you of some things. So after the fall of the U.S., the Somali Republic government in '91, Siad Barre regime in '91, and Somaliland reclaiming its sovereignty, the Americans had what used to be known as a dual-track policy for Somaliland and Somalia. There was no Somalia, by the way, in '91. There was Somaliland, and they were like trying to bring back, and that's why the UN peacekeeping mission and the Navy SEALs and the story of Black Hawk Down to kind of bring some peace and order to Somalia, started. And so yeah, there was a dual track policy that existed in the early part of the '90s and 2000s, but then that changed. I think was it towards the Clinton regime or the Bush regime that changed? I can't remember when, but anyways, towards the end of the Bush regime, what ended up happening? The end of Obama's regime, I think it was 2012, the then U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Jendai Fraser, said upon leaving, obviously, she said that one of the biggest mistakes that she made and she really regrets greatly is not recognizing Somaliland. Jendai Fraser, the U.S. Secretary of State for Africa, part of the State Department. So basically what happened is America had a dual track policy to deal with Somaliland. And then obviously this thing called Somalia that doesn't exist on paper. It's not a thing, it's a, whatever. The thing that we know to be Somalia today, it's only came about in 2012. And it has a very bloody history from 91 to 2012. Very stark contrast. So the American government and the State Department made this transition, and in the U.S., the U.S. African State Department, the African Bureau sub department said that we'll have a single policy, and that was a mistake. And now the Americans are realizing, well, no, this can't be right, and it's not.
to, more use like social media platforms, or use, like, for example, any way to educate people around the world that we are a great country. I mean, as you can see, I watch YouTube sometimes, and I see like how beautiful our country is. Like, there's no, for example, no like any types of war or any types of issues where you see like any like bomb threats or bomb like shootings or any of that. It's like peace and just you get what I mean. And yeah, so it's just amazing to see, and we need to like help each other to talk more about our country and to help our country, even though we're not there right now. For example, with me, and I thank you, Michael. I thank you, AQ, and yeah.
I certainly appreciate that, Abdul, and keep up the great work from your end, wherever you travel in the world or wherever you reside. Maybe one day you can go back and travel and meet with, Abdul, the AQIQ, who's speaking today as our guest, and show you around the area and the country. And hopefully one day I can feature, maybe in the future we can have a show talking about the official recognition of the country of Somaliland. I think that'd be an awesome day in the future. And I think it may not be that far off, depending on the geopolitical movement that's going on with China and with Russia, and particularly with Taiwan, coming up maybe before the end of the decade, and that would just be an awful mess. But if we have to recognize Somaliland as a way to blunt Chinese influence in the region, I think that's a great way to fast track it. And again, this is not to break up Somalia. Aiden said that they want top down. This sometimes, like I said, it's better to have reconciliation later on down the road, but individual smaller nation states, similar to Balkans. So everybody says it's a bad thing. You look at the Balkans, and there's been some areas, decades of stability and peace, although helped out with UN peacekeepers in the United States as well. So maybe we can have, we talked a little bit about Camp Lemonnier. Maybe if that's moved to Somaliland and China has the base in Djibouti, I think the only reason we haven't left is because we don't want Djibouti to become completely a Chinese client state, which there's movement in that direction as it stands. So that's the one reason. But they do, like Abdullah said, they do shine lasers into the eyes of our pilots and other things that are very deleterious in the region, and we don't want to have happen, but they do happen. And so I think you providing a great service to yourself and to your family and to your country, Somaliland. And once again, I want to thank you for coming on the show. Mohammed, please go ahead with your question for myself or for Abdul, our guest speaker today.
Thank you so much, Sir Michael. And my question is, like, it's been said, history is not the past, left by the past. It influences the present and it may shape the future. So, to be historically correct, Somaliland had thousands of years of distinct history from Somalia, from the world's number one failed state of Somalia. We have hundreds of thousands of years of distinct history. We have been Adal Empire, we have been Ifati Empire. We went through a lot of different history from Somalia, even different colonial history, with Somalia. So we have unfortunately had 30 years of chaotic, legally unbinding union with Somalia, with the world's number one failed state, della Somalia Italiana. And we have had 30 years of union dissolution with Somalia. We reclaimed our independence, and we have right now liberal democratic values, freedom of press, freedom of speech, full peaceful transitions of presidential power in East Africa, in Horn of Africa in particular, where you see the situation in Yemen, in Eritrea, in Djibouti, in Ethiopia, in Somalia. And my question is, I've seen like it was mentioned that China's first proxy war in Horn of Africa. So what does this mean for the United States State Department in terms of speaking from a geostrategical perspective, speaking from geopolitical perspective, from geo-economical perspective, having just seen, the issue of this proxy war in Horn of Africa, the first Chinese proxy war in East Africa, in Horn of Africa in particular, and in terms of seeing, in terms of evaluating the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and which is the global, one of the main global trade choke points. So my question is, what does this mean for the United States geostrategically, geopolitically, and geoeconomically? Thank you.
I'll go ahead and take that first. In the Navy, we have acronyms for everything. So when I was in the Navy over there, I learned very distinctly the GU, the GOA, the BAM. So that's Bab el-Mandeb, the Gulf of Oman, the Gulf of Aden, formerly called different names throughout the history, but now it's those are pretty much well-established names. So I want to do an experiment. Just bear with me. I'll go to Google Earth. I have it called up already, and if you zoom in to the little tiny islands off of, you look at Mayotte, and then you go over, and then you look at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and you drop a pin to measure it. So I'll go from Mayotte at a point, and then go over to the coast of, let's drop it to Mahole. That's only 14 miles, roughly 14 miles, maybe 15, depending on where you drop the first original pin. So if China was to gain control of that area, it would be a similar situation that we find ourselves with Iran, where they control the straits there, the Strait of Hormuz. And if they were to ever go to war with Iran, which Israel may actually do this year, you could see oil spiking astronomically, maybe even, for the U.S. here, it's right, $3.30 or so a gallon, $3.21, depending on what station. It depends. It fluctuates state by state. But that's what the price is where I'm at. You could easily see that go up to $10 for regular, way higher in different countries that don't have refining capacity or rely directly on shipments from other nation states. Of course, they would always mark the price up as it goes. So you could see a similar situation where China will control through, again, area denial, which is a maritime policy for mining or placing blockades via surface warfare ships, and potential for submarine warfare as well, ASW. So they could take that area and deter any maritime traffic. And so, China's policy, its Brick and Road Initiative, BRI for short, is one not necessarily of trade through nations, though it is that, but it's a way of debt trapping nations into acquiescence with and subservience to Beijing and the CCP or CPC, depending on the acronym that you wish to use. So from their perspective, they put out an air of, hey, it's great. It's similar to what the U.S. did with grants and loans and different things. And they're learning from us. But what we didn't do is debt trap countries beyond recognition and say, hey, okay, well, we're going to put everything here under our control. Now, we do have a poor history of that, similar things that we've done in South America during the Cold War, but we never, 100% said, okay, well, essentially now your whole country belongs to us. You look at different revolutions and things throughout the history. And in the modern era, we create sovereign, diplomatic relations, nation-state to nation-state relations. China eventually wants to have that, but they want to eventually control, not through, like a Roman Empire of sorts, but through, I would say, if you look at the Soviet relations with different Soviet republics, how they were eventually acquiescing to Moscow, and then they eventually created SR control, client state, if you will, directly controlled by Moscow. That's something they want to do, even if it's not similarly analogous to complete territorial control, in the sense that they're a union of sorts. They want to have non-union relationships with those individual areas and partner states, and then have control through Beijing. A perfect example of this would be through Pakistan. You look at Pakistan, the port of Gwadar that they have debt trapped Pakistan into, and now China has said, okay, great, can't pay it back. Now your entire port of Gwadar belongs to us, and we'll control it and we'll call the shots. And so if you go back into Google Earth, I don't know if you're doing this now, but I'll do it from my end, and you again see the narrow corridor through the Gulf of Aden that most of that maritime traffic has to flow. That's essentially what their aim is. Their aim is to control that choke point there and deter and blunt as much as they can from, our base there in Djibouti, which is only a stone's throw, geopolitically speaking, from that choke point. If you bear with me, if you go up all the way up into the Red Sea, and then you look there, the port of Sudan, and Sudan, not South Sudan, but the actual nation Sudan before it split into two. Russia now wants to have a base there of operations, a maritime base that they can put naval ships, as well as, I'm sure that they'll do this, an airstrip for drones and fixed wing, as well as helicopters. So as we move forward in time, what we don't want to have again is territories of Africa, long established, great histories, empires, smaller, republics that are subsumed by what they called back then the Great Game. And we don't want to have that. We want to have federal, if we can, but if not, nation states that are made up of partnerships with their internal people, as well as external partnerships with relationships within the continent of Africa, as well as external partnerships with the United States and their allies throughout the region. You look at some of the partnerships with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and other great powers in the region. We don't want to have land and territorial conquest of old, and hopefully through recognition of Somaliland, we can deter Chinese expansionist ideas and designs in the region. Hopefully that answers the question. Sorry if I went on a tangent, but I had to explain, the geographical choke points in the region. And let me turn it over to Abdul, AQIQ, for some expansion on that from his perspective.
Thank you for that, Michael. You've really done really well, actually. I've got nothing much to add on that. I mean, you are the military expert. You've done tours in this region. You know this better than me. But just as you rightfully said, especially at least where Somaliland's concerned, the Gulf of Aden, the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, very important security place for Israel as well. So we have a delegation, African and Arab delegation that has been invited to Jerusalem next month. I think this month, actually. Sorry, yeah, in March, I think it is. Later in the month, where we're going to be going, Somaliland analysts and government members and think tanks, to kind of discuss a wide myriad of issues with, I think it's called the Jewish International, JICP or something. I don't know what the acronym stands for. On a myriad of issues, not only security, but also food, climate change, amongst other things, with a myriad of African and Arab countries like Oman, UAE, Saudi, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somaliland. I think Somalia is also going as well. That's this month. So yeah, Israel is kind of picking up its interest, and obviously we've seen the peace that's come in the Middle East through the Abraham Accord. So yeah, that important region is very important, as you rightfully said. The Strait of Hormuz, the Iranians, the Persians kind of control that important chokehold where a lot of the trade comes out of the Gulf. The Persian Gulf, the Iranians pretty much control that. The Emiratis can't really say much, but it is what it is. And then there's another important chokehold in that South China Sea next towards China, a chokehold that China does not like being surrounded by Americans on all sides. Whether it's towards the east or north and the south, in Japan, South Korea, Guam, and Philippines now as well. There was a military training exercise just recently, trilateral, I think, with the Japanese and the Philippines in that part of the world, with a view. So yeah, there is a battle. The battle is taking place on the oceans, so to speak, as the olden days of pirates pre-airplanes and modern forms of transportation. But yeah, that Indian Ocean, that Red Sea, is very important for all superpowers. And so China is trying to work its way through there. It's already bankrupted some of the countries you already mentioned, like South Korea, the Gwadar port in Pakistan, in the semi-autonomous region of Balochistan. It owns that now officially. And the same thing in Djibouti. Djibouti is $3 billion, nearly $3 billion in debt to the Chinese. So that's basically puts them in a very risky situation. And China has kind of evolved in these last 10, 12 years, so to speak, from the idea of just like, oh, we'll give you debts and we'll give you infrastructural loans and whatnot, but you guys do what you want. But rather what China has been doing in the last couple of years is, as it's matured politically and geopolitically as well, to kind of infiltrate and kind of get its interests from the ruling powers and the governments and the institutions, and kind of have influence in the internal workings on of the country now. That's the level that China's going. So what China's doing is it's trying to work its way around from the Indian Ocean all the way around to the other side of West Africa towards the Atlantic Ocean as well. And so it's only a matter of time. I think there's the Russians, I think, were looking at some bases there. I know there was some conflict in West Africa in the last year or 18 months ago with the former French colonies. So the China has been fairly active. That's why the Americans have realized that, and they kind of created the U.S. African Command. I think in 2016, is it, if I'm not mistaken, or was it just before that? Anyways, to kind of like in Africa, they had the U.S. Command in Europe and other places, but Africa was kind of neglected from American policymakers on a whole, and that's where it left a gap for Russia and China and the emerging countries, the BRIC nations, so to speak, to kind of take advantage of this situation. India is doing a lot as well in that region. India is competing with China, hence why Pakistan is working with China. So it's all weird, but yeah, it's about strategic locations. Just one point I wanted to mention, and I'll end it here, is China is basically kind of got supremacy on the underwater sea cables of in Somaliland and Djibouti off the coast. So there's a cable run by a Chinese company called Peace Cable. I'll send that to you, Michael. But Peace Cable is a Chinese-owned company, Hong Kong subsidiary, and they basically are making the fiber optics from Djibouti, Somaliland, all the way to Pakistan in Gwadar area. And so basically they're controlling the flow of information, the 5G and the broadband through Huawei technology. And we know what Huawei, the fiasco there was a couple of years ago with Canada, and I think also in America, where I think Donald Trump kind of said, we're not going to have Huawei chips here because of this, the lack of security and the surveillance that they were doing and the information they were sending back, contravening international rules on data protection and things of that nature. So there is a big influence, and another reason why Somaliland is important geopolitically as well is Somaliland is a mineral resource rich country in iron, copper, tin, and uranium, and so many other things, as well as oil. There's now an oil that has been discovered in Somaliland, and it's not new oil, by the way, because oil was discovered in Somaliland as far back as 1910. So Somaliland, even before Saudi Arabia, and they did the first drilling in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, oil was discovered in Somalia. I think, was it in the 1920s possibly? I can't remember the exact date, don't quote me on it, but oil has been in Somaliland and in that region. In fact, the oil that is in the Middle East and the Gulf comes downstream from the Gulf of Aden, right? And so that's why there's this big mess again. It's to do with resources and things of that nature. So so Somaliland, we've got poised for the drilling. The Taiwanese British company Janel is subject to start drilling in Somaliland at the first quarter of next year, 2024. And so that's why kind of then there's this kind of mess and this situation that's going on for Somaliland at the moment to kind of hinder that progress. Because China would deal, I'm sure, with Somaliland once it's recognized. It'll have some relationship, but at the moment it's just like, we don't want to work with you. We'd rather have you under our control, just like we have under Somalia. And Somalia at the moment really is not an independent country, right? It's a vassal state, And when we say it's a failed state, we're saying that not in the pejorative sense, but rather it's a political terminology that's used in terms that, it's an indicator of the country's status economically, security, peace, and on a range of other indicators. And so basically, Turkey has got one of the largest bases. NATO member Turkey has one of the largest bases outside of its country in Somalia. And they've been there since the 90s. And they've got even a space program in Mogadishu there as well. So the Turks and the Chinese and the Qataris are there. The Qataris have invested a huge amount as well in Turkey, in Somalia, and also in Somaliland. We are more aligned with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and so there's that other geopolitics taking place between the Arab countries. We know there's the race between UAE and Saudi versus Qatar, and so there's that geopolitics also playing out in the Horn of Africa between the oil-rich oil kingdom, Arab kingdoms, as well as this so-called East and West potential. So yeah, I think the location you really summarized it really well, Michael. Very important strategic part of the world where we are, connects to the Indian Ocean, Red Sea on all sides, and it's just who controls that maritime and controls the trade route and controls the information and the semiconductors and the chips and stuff like that, which Taiwan produces, basically has ultimate supremacy. And so that's what this next arms race, so to speak, this neo Cold War taking place, technological Cold War taking place between the two big superpowers at the moment, and the emerging economies and the old world order of the rules-based order, of America, Britain, France, Germany, etc. So that's that.
Thanks again, Abdul. For Mohammed and everybody on the call, on the space, I put on the nest, the Somaliland's oil find could reset the regional balance. Here's how, via TC Africa. So that's an article from a site called theconversation.com that speaks about what Abdul was just talking about. And it really goes into detail. And to answer and to kind of piggyback off of what you were said, it wasn't 2016. It was AFRICOM was established in 1 October 2007. Then it was activated officially 1 October 2008, which was a year later. So it's been active for 14 years, 5 months. It's the youngest, I believe. Well, maybe Cybercom is younger than AFRICOM. I'd have to look that up. But it's a unified combatant command. The interesting thing, though, is it's not based out of the continent of Africa. It is based out of the Kelly Barracks in Stuttgart, Germany. There was some talk about shifting it to potentially Lemonier or maybe Egypt or some other partner nations and sites, but that is yet to be concluded. And so that's something to look forward to in the future, especially as Africa becomes a more powerful continent. If you look at demographic projections in the future, the majority of the growth populations wise as Asia ages and as Europe ages and America ages out is in Asia and Africa, particularly Southeast Asia and Africa. So as those regions grow, the United States, China, and others will want to have better partnerships with, places like Somaliland, Djibouti, and even better, I would say, relationships with well-established partners such as Egypt, Libya, as you see the fragmentation in Libya, and you already see Chinese influence there with the different factions. Tunisia, but also look at, I might even have a show just on this one because this is a growing topic of concern and of influence in the great new game that we have of global African geopolitics, which is Nigeria. If you look at the country of Nigeria going forward, it's supposed to be a global powerhouse past 2050. Now, that is if they can ever get established, get rid of corruption and get rid of different things that they have. But that is a problem in every nation. It's not just the specific Nigerian problem. So I might do a show on Nigeria going forward. But then there's also different problems in the country or in the continent of Africa at large that I'd maybe want to do a different show on in the future. But I see there was somebody who just raised their hand. Go ahead and send me a request in the next couple of minutes if you want to speak again, because I do want to try to end this at 3 p.m. local. I know it's getting late where Abdul is. I don't want to keep you up all night, Abdul. Although that would be a great show. I know there's another couple of guys. There's the one show I listen to, Mario, and he goes for like 12 hours straight. I don't know how he does it, but definitely these shows are shorter than his. Okay, I see your request. Go ahead, Burr, with your question for myself or for Abdul.
Hey Michael, how you doing? How's it going, AQ? Honestly, I didn't have a question. I just wanted to add just a little history. Just wanted to say that you know, America and the United States is actually um, not new to the Somaliland. They've been doing trades with them from a long time ago, and actually, even during the 1901 all the way to 1912. Um, there was a lot of skin and hide that used to be and livestock that used to be shipped all the way to the United States and Europe, and the United States was the number one consumer at that time. During the same time as well, you would have a lot of expeditions. We used to have the big African games that would happen in Somaliland in that region, specifically in Somaliland, and a lot of famous Americans would go there. One of them is Arthur Donaldson Smith. He was a medical doctor, and he was there actually from 1894 all the way to 1896. And he's written a lot of books about it. And it's just our history is kind of not put out there. It's hidden in a way. There's also discoveries of tools that was used that are 200,000 years old. They are at the Smithsonian Institute museum. It's out there and it's dated back, and it's said that it's tools that was used by Adam and his descendants. So we do. There was actually a famous baseball player that came to the big African games to Berbera as well. 1902, there was two girls from England. There's a book about them. It's called The Two Dianas in Somaliland. They traveled actually alone to Somaliland and did a whole expedition of hunting during the hunting games in Somaliland by themselves. They had nobody with them. They went over there. Their uncle who used to go hunting over there told them about the way to do things. Like you got to go to a headman and then hire a caravan and so, and they actually did it by themselves. And that tells you that the democracy in itself and the democratic values, it's something that was already part of our lifestyle. So just wanted to add that in there, that Somaliland is not new to the world. Everybody knew Somaliland prior to anything called Somalia. We've had relationships, we've had people that would travel, and there's a lot of books written about it. So just wanted to add that on there. Another book is Sports in Somaliland. Another one is Lion Hunting in Somaliland. And all of these actually talk about our people. In the book, the customs and the way we welcome them, and it shows the deep history that we have. So I just wanted to add on there that Somaliland is nothing new. Somaliland has a deep, rich history. It's just that the 30 years that, the genocide that happened and the 30 years we were rebuilding, a lot of our history has not been taught. And that's the thing that we're currently doing, which is just going after our history and letting the people know, letting our generations know, letting the younger generation know how deep our history is. And just wanted to add that on there. And thank you for the time.
Thanks for your comments, Burr, and for coming on the show. Go ahead, AQ, for your reply.
No reply. I just want to say thank you for Burr for that reminder and for some of these historical facts and documents. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that I don't even know about Somaliland history. So you educated me about more deeply about the American baseball players. But one fact that I do know, and I just wanted to add to what Burr was just saying, I don't know if you know about this, Michael. Did you know NASA used to have their space manned flights leave from Berbera in the 70s, right? Not many people know that. Everybody knows about Cape Canaveral and stuff like that, but they don't know that the Berbera in the 70s, in the 80s, was the location where the US NASA did some of their space explorations. And so, yeah, so there is a even more recent history than going back as far back as the 1900s or whatever it was that Burr mentioned. So that's just wanted to add to that. And the Berbera airport, by the way, was built by the Russians, the former Soviet Union Russians, given that Ziad Barre was a fascist. He was a socialist, Marxist, fascist, communist man, like the Cubans and other countries. He basically, had good relations with Russia. And so the Russians kind of developed the Berbera airport. Again, the former Soviet Russians did as well. And it's that same airport that later the Americans were using to make their manned space missions flights go from Berbera, ironically. So it's a fascinating part of the world, more recently and in recent times as well. So I just wanted to add to that and say thank you to Burr for that extra
Yeah,
info.
and Mr. AQ, don't forget that Somaliland did side and stand and fight in the World War II. They also fought in World War One, and in World War II, Somaliland was fighting alongside Britain and other allies while Somalia was with the Nazi and the fascist movement, and they were actually fighting against us. Even the period where they took over Berbera, Hargeisa, and Seyla, it was with their help, you know. But we did fight back, and our history is deep and it's rich. And sooner or later, actually now we are writing books about it, and the world is gonna know about Somaliland, and it's gonna know about the contributions we made. You know, like yes, we are a protectorate. We did make treaties and everything, but we were not subjugated. We were always free. We were always born free, and the world knows about how free our people were. Um, like you don't make treaties with people and then say at the same time these people were colonized. We were never colonized, and the first discovery was oil was in 1914, and they actually tested the oil in Somaliland. It was an area that was close to Berbera, but it's like we have our own conditions. We don't sell our own people. Our forefathers were really smart. Even when they did the treaties, they did the treaties in the water. And during the 75 years that the Britain was in our lands, there was not one child that was born in Somaliland. When they would give birth, they would go to Aden or they would go back home to England. And that's part of the treaties that we made with Britain. So, what type of colonization is where for 75 years not one child was born there, while the surrounding other countries, which are now countries like Eritrea and Ethiopia, they've had many Italian children that was born there. So that tells you that my people, my forefathers, were really, really, really one of the greatest people, and a lot of them are not mentioned in history books, but soon they will be mentioned, and the world is going to know about them. Like Sharmarke, he was a great, great, great sultan and a leader that was doing businesses and deals with a lot of people. We had the Berber Affair. We had people that would come from all the way from Bombay to Ras Al Khaimah to Saudi Arabia, Ghanaian traders that would come and trade with us, where people would wait, and like the rest of the world would wait for this fair to end, so all these caravans could come back and people could hear the news of what's going on around the world, because that's the place where people will congregate, talk, and talk about the latest news. And then when the caravans would go back, these news would be spread to the rest of the people. And so the importance of Berbera and Somaliland to the world, and even the archaeology discovery that Somaliland, even the species, there was so much species that was discovered in Somaliland that's not found anywhere else in the world. You know, species of birds, species of fish, species of animals and birds. Like there's so much deep history that we have. So sorry about hijacking your space a little bit, but I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
No, you're not hijacking at all, and I appreciate your comments and talking about the variety of wildlife and different things that are present in Somaliland. It really makes me want to take a trip over there one day. Maybe if I have the time and the money to do so, I'll definitely check out Somaliland, because I haven't been in that region. And just a little point of clarification: I wasn't based there. I spent some time in Djibouti, but most of my time in the region, a few months, maybe 3 months or so, was off the coast of Yemen, taking care of some stuff that we were assigned to do over there, and in concert with UAE and some of the other partners. And that's a whole nother ball of wax that I don't have time to get into now with the war in Yemen that really has, in my view, destroyed the country of Yemen. And, it might be the case that maybe North Yemen and South Yemen should come back, that the country might have to be split again. You see the Shiite influence in the it's always kind of weird. They say North and South Yemen, but really it should be, in my view, to West and East Yemen, as you look at it from a map. But in the more southerly part, closer to Djibouti, that part. So maybe I do a show on Yemen in the future and talk about the genocide and the blockading of and destruction of ports and different things that have occurred, and to talk about that also. That's something, blockading of ports and destruction of cities and things, that China has the capacity to do should they ever want to take a more what's the right word, destructive approach to blocking Somaliland independence. You're definitely seeing that with any talk of them taking Taiwan, potentially maybe within the next 5 years. I've done a few shows on that. If you want to check out my channel on YouTube at Flashpoint Geopolitics, you can learn about what their plans and designs for Taiwan are, as well as Iran, which is a pressing topic this year, because Israel might hit Iran this year or maybe next year. It depends on what PM Netanyahu wants to do. I think we have time for maybe one more question. So let me turn it over to Geopolitics Africa TV. And they're connecting, should be live here in a second. Go ahead, Geopolitics Africa TV, with your question.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much. My question is that Somaliland is the only country that the Chinese is not influencing at the moment in the Horn of Africa, or Africa as a whole. Somaliland is the only country that China have no foothold. Somaliland refused to actually sideline with the Chinese, unlike most of other African countries. And the last country signed the Belt and Road Initiative was Eritrea. 2021, November 25. They signed in Belt and Road Initiative. They have got huge military base in Djibouti. They have got huge investment, billions of dollars in Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, you name it, all of Africa. Somaliland is the single country that the Chinese are not investing and have no political foothold at all. So my question is, Somaliland, if it decides to sideline with either Russia or China, that's going to be the end of United States for Africa, because United States need a strong position that it can actually dominate militarily and politically is Somaliland is the most strategic country in Africa, because of the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and the Middle East. Any military navy can actually dominate if they have got base in Berbera. So my question is, why the United States administration, in particularly the Biden administration and its ambassador in Mogadishu, why are they ignoring Somaliland importance, strategic importance? Why they are not, the America is not really serious to invest and engage both politically and militarily with the Somaliland government? Because at the moment it seems that Somaliland, the United States Biden administration put all its eggs on Mogadishu. I mean, they are actually, they are more, if you like, they are more into Somali politics than Somaliland politics. And Somalia is a failed state. The government there cannot even control the capital. So why the America are so eager to invest Somalia rather than Somaliland? And what do you think will happen if Somaliland decides to sideline with Russia or the Chinese? Isn't that the end of America or United States for Africa? Because Somaliland is highly strategic. That's what I was wondering, and that's what I want to ask you, Michael, if you don't mind.
Absolutely, and it's a great question. Kind of talked on a little bit before about how they can choke off the Gulf there with the short distance between Yemen and some of the cities there in Djibouti itself. Ideally, we would want to have, and I put this up here, Abdi Garad had shared with me And I posted there, and actually Abdul had shared that as well. A quote from Abdi Garad from April 7th, 2022, about the dual track approach. Ideally, I think this actually, the shortest explanation is that we're so tied down, Department of State and Department of Defense, with the war in Ukraine right now with Russia, that we've lost focus on Africa and other parts of the world. Another point of the world that I want to do a show on is the Pacific Island states. And case in point in this would be Kiribati. The Chinese have taken and have signed a deal to build out a base in Kiribati that was one of our old World War II PTO, that's Pacific Theater Operations air bases, and put planned ships there as well as PLAF air sites, and expand that out for maybe bombers and jets, maybe even helicopters, but primarily with the distances needed to cover, be fixed wing aircraft. And so I put this on my channel before I even did space shows years ago, and how we are not, basically offering a whole crap ton of money to Kiribati and the people there to say, hey, you know what, we will match or even beat the deal that the Chinese are giving to you. And I think if all else fails, we should go in and take those airstrips again, because it's been almost 80 years, but those airstrips are still viable. And here's the other thing, they're right up against the water. So what they would have close to Pearl, about maybe, I don't even think 1,000 miles off of Pearl Harbor, is an air base with docks for ships and bombers, destroyers, Renhai class cruisers, to go ahead and maybe use offensive capabilities in our part of the Pacific close to Pearl. And I say that not as a distraction from the topic at hand, which is Somaliland, but to give an analogy of what they might try to do in the region, and why we've lost focus, and taken our eye off the ball. I think the United States, as a global superpower, there's an expression here, walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. I think we should do that. We did it, pretty much every day throughout the Cold War. And it's kind of like, the phrase muscle memory. If you lose your muscle memory, if you don't exercise certain parts of your body. And so, particularly when it comes to doing things that require those muscles. So we have to do what's called in the military, reestablish our muscle memory with strategic partnerships with areas of the world that we haven't focused on in a long time. The last engagement of any serious consideration that we talked about in the media, and particularly with the military use, has been over 30 years now. It's been, 33, 32 years since we had the Battle of Mogadishu in Somalia, and we tried to do the peacekeeping ops, were eventually canceled by President Clinton. And in Somalia, for Somaliland, we haven't really talked about that in any major sense at all. And so I think it's high time that we talk about Somaliland and our partnership with that region, and hopefully the country, and a sovereign country going forward, as a way to try to deter any Chinese global influence in that region. And by Chinese global influence, what they mean is Chinese global control. The CPC wants to use business partnerships in the region and trade as a way of, I almost look at modern China as the Roman Empire. The Romans did the same thing. They established footholds in regions that weren't theirs, starting with the conflict against the Sabine tribes in Italy itself, and expanding north and south and outwards, taking Greece, which they renamed Achaea, and other areas after the war with Carthage, completely devastating that region and destroying Carthage to a T, even committing a genocide by their legions to wipe out the entirety of the population and sow the city with salt so that nothing would grow again. And there's a famous senator there that always would call for the destruction. At the end of every speech, he would say, Carthago delendia est, which means Carthage must be destroyed. China is not saying that per se, but they are saying part and parcel of their doctrine, both from the Communist Party and through the military aspect, through the PLA, is that we want to establish worldwide dominance and control by 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the modern state of China, the People's Republic of China. And so, to answer your question, I think honestly it's because we've lost our focus. We've spent 20 years in the desert in Iraq and Afghanistan, in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the desert in Iraq and other areas. And to reiterate, we've taken our eye off the ball. And at that, let me turn it over to Abdul to see maybe if you have a different take on that, why we haven't placed so much of a focus on Somaliland per se, as much as other regions in Africa, particularly Northern Africa. Did you want to go ahead and take a stab at a geopolitics question?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Michael, for that. Good points, really elucidated. Thank you to Geopolitics as well for the question. Good to have you here. So yeah, I mean, look, I think you touched on most of the points anyways, but look, the things go in cycles, they change. So, in the 90s, at the beginning of the, when Somaliland got its, re-established its sovereignty, there was a US dual track policy, even though there was only one thing called Somaliland, but they realized that there was these two separate things. There was Mogadishu and then there was Hargeisa, two separate entities. And so there was a dual track policy that the Americans had for a large part of the 90s. And I think it was towards the Bush era, or was it towards the end of the Clinton era? Anyways, it was the turn of the millennium that they changed suddenly to this kind of, to a one Somalia policy at the State Department level. And that's been like that for a while. And it wasn't until, I think, 2012, 2012 did Jendai Fraser, the US Secretary of State for African Affairs, mentioned that one of the biggest failures, this is after she left office, she didn't say this while she was in office, she said one of her biggest failures in office was not recognizing Somaliland, or at least being more proactive. So yeah, there is a multitude of different, problems here where the problems arise from. So there are problems that arise at the State Department level. Even today, 2023, the US Secretary of State for African Affairs, Molly Fee, even with her comments that she speaks about Somaliland and so whatever, you can see that the Biden administration and the State Department is a little bit behind the curve, so to speak. But the good news is Secretary Blinken, Secretary of State Foreign Affairs, is going to Ethiopia next week actually, to Addis Ababa. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done there as well. Ethiopia has not really been happy with the United States, given since the peace agreement was signed in South Africa. The Ethiopian government felt that they've been neglected, and rightfully so, because they were taken out of this preferential trade agreement, AGOA, AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunities Act, that basically gives preferential treatment to certain African countries to trade like tariff-free in America and their partners. And so what ended up happening is, because of this ongoing dispute and the war in Ethiopia, I don't know how many years now it's been since they've signed the peace agreement, the Americans punishing them, and so they've kind of been flexing their muscles. And so now Secretary of State Blinken is going there next week. But the good thing is, look, America is not just only, the State Department is not the only aspect of the government. It's a trilateral system. You've got the legislature as well as the executive as well. So the legislator, in terms of the House of Representatives and the Senate, both houses are fully aware of the engagement and the need for direct engagement. Hence why they included this, Somaliland in the for the first time in the National Defense Act agreement for the fiscal coming year of 2023, right? And they mentioned in there, if you read it, it's a big document. You'll see that they even have like Somaliland, Taiwan, USA relationship. It's a trilateral relationship that Taiwan is part of this kind of bottleneck, and it fits into through to Somaliland via Taiwan. But also the connection to Somaliland also happens through one of the other regional neighbors and partners, through the United Arab Emirates, who are an ally of America. as well, right? But the only missing block at the moment is Israel. We haven't had that relationship with Israel formalized, and now that Israel has formed peace agreements with the neighboring countries in the Horn of Africa, in the Middle East, namely Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other Arab countries would follow suit. Means that Israel is seeing that its security and its future, as well. Again, a country we've not had much relationship with as well. Directly, I'm talking about, although indirectly we've had relationship. But yeah, so the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Houses, both houses of legislature have voted in favor of this Defense Act. They also got an act at the table. Christopher, representative, I think he's a senator, Christopher Van Halen of Maryland. He's putting on the table the Somaliland Partnership Act. And that's going through some revisions at the moment. The chairman of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, Representative McCall, representative from Texas, has been advocating a lot, given that he's the chair of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, for direct engagement and relationship to Somalia. So things are kind of slow. So even this Defense Act that Somaliland was part of, the U.S., the State Department didn't have a choice, because this was recommendation that came from the Department of Defense and Pentagon, and so there was no choice. So once the agreement was made and it was voted in both houses, it was put into law. So there are people working against the U.S. interest. Namely, we have a Somali from Somalia, Minnesotan Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who has been advocating against Somaliland and advocating against U.S. national interests, which is a problem. In fact, when the Defense Act was being signed into law in December 2022, on the day that it was voted into law, it was on President Biden's desk. She flew on that day to Somalia to basically to kind of say, listen, guys, the game is up. This whole Somali thing, you need to stop it or come up with some new thing. And it was shortly after her visit did we have all this mess that happened with Somalia, this direct incursion of Somali soldiers and whatever into Somaliland in the eastern part of the country, and created this chaos that Somaliland has never had for 30 years as well. So yeah, the people in the U.S. Department, in terms of the legislature, the Department of Defense, Pentagon, U.S. African Command, the Combined Joint Task Force in the Horn of Africa and Djibouti, they all know the strategicness and the importance of Somaliland. The question is not the strategicness of the point. The question is matter of not if, but when will Somaliland be recognized, right? And so Thibaut Nagy, former U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia, and said that, listen, Somaliland needs to be recognized ASAP, and he was a former ambassador to Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, and a friend of Somaliland, Thibaut Nagy, out of Texas as well. So yeah, there are a lot of people doing good work. AEI, the think tank, is well aware. They publish a lot of publications and reports on this. The Rockefeller Institute, the Heritage Foundation, like some of the top institutes and think tanks in America are really pressuring State Department through their articles and their reports by their analysts on a whole multitude of events. So the question is not if Somaliland will get the recognition, but just when, and that's more of a political will rather than anything legally outstanding. But there are friends of Somaliland, as in the Senate and the Republicans. And so the good news is, ever since, by the way, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar returned back to the U.S. at the beginning of the year, she was removed, by the way, from the subcommittee of the African Foreign Affairs Committee. And she used to sit on the East African subcommittee part of that department as well. And so she was a huge risk to us as well, and a problem for Somaliland. And she was constantly advocating against Somaliland and things of that nature. And there are Somalis at the moment and Somalians that live in America, whether they're congresswomen or, these groups that they have, advocacy groups that think that they can change America's opinion. They don't understand that once America makes a decision, or any superpower, it's in their interest to go ahead with it, right? This is not something to do with Somaliland. In fact, a lot of what's happening with Somaliland and in recent 2, 3, 4 years is purely not serendipity, but purely as a function of just the changing world order and the geopolitics of the region and the wider world as well. It's not something that we have been doing work in the background. Our governments, successive governments have had work, and we've had engagements with the African Union and the UN in the 90s and the 2000s as well. So it's in recently though, a lot of things has been moving and accelerated really faster, purely, as I said, as a function of just the changing landscape of the international arena and what's going on, specifically in the last couple of years. So the question is now, the Americans need to engage better. I mean, the Department of Defense already have made their recommendations. The houses are voting, and they know what they're doing. So it's just a matter of when. But now with this incursion on Somalia, by Somalia, on Somaliland soil, with their soldiers and their Al-Shabaab, and ISIS and all these people that have just flooded into the eastern part of the network, creating this kind of, feeding off this kind of, whatever, there's internal problems in every country. No country is perfect, right? And trying to exacerbate situation to purely undermine Somaliland's sovereignty and legal status. That's all it's really about. Because the question could be asked, why hasn't this issue ever happened to Somaliland's history in its last 31 years? Yeah, Somaliland's had internal disputes internally in its country and things like that, but it's always resolved its issues, even in the last 30 years. Why have we got this thing rather profound, like a month, the month after the National Defense Act was signed in the United States, and all the stuff that was coming as well. So things are kind of moving super fast in the Middle East. And you're right, Iran is going to be attacked at the moment by Israel. With the way that Iran is developing this enrichment uranium, to like 84%. That's not something Israel doesn't just wait and say, oh, you get to 100%, and then no, Israel is going to take a preemptive strike like they did in 81 against Saddam during the Iraq war. It attacked several facilities as well. So Israel is not used to this, and so a lot of the problems that's coming as a result today, by the way, for Somaliland, really is as a result of it trying to be friendly with its neighbors in this volatile region and not intermingle. And if it was, my choice, like just my personal opinion, Somaliland should have been a bit more aggressive, given that Somalia, for many years, even prior to this year, for many years and decades, has been kind of incursion and just threatening Somaliland, and through its politics and through its rhetoric. And Somaliland, what it should have done is done what Kenya has done in the border, in the southern part of the country, and Kismayo, and created a buffer zone in the border. And so they have their soldiers there. So what Somalia should have done is created a buffer zone in the northern part of Somalia to kind of secure it against there. And then maybe the international community would have taken note. But anyways, we're past that now. The situation is where we are. There is a conflict. The US understands the nature of it. To what extent, how fast they acted, only time will tell. But yeah, this conflict has even disrupted this US. In February last month, the US was supposed to come for a training facility, justified accord with 24 other member states, African and other countries. And that was disrupted purely as a result of this insurrection and civil unrest that's been caused. Timed aptly, by the way. It's not coincidence and it's not accidental. And we know that there are other state actors that are behind this as well. That are fueling this conflict in the region, and the intentions are clear. It's obvious that they want to kind of bring Somaliland to its knees and subjugate it, and to kind of fall in line with like a domino effect, like the rest of the neighboring countries. So yeah, but it will be a matter of time. But the question is, how does this play out? Not looking good for Biden, at least for the remainder of his term. If the Iranian Saudi China trilateral agreement is anything to go by, that was signed yesterday, not looking good, so to speak. That's a big failure on the Biden administration. So we can only look forward to and see where we go from here is the answer to the question. The future is really unknown. So yeah, back to you, Michael.
Hey, great. Thanks again for that and all the explanatory detail that you provided. I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. I want to go to Garad Saeed Abdullah. Please go ahead with your question or comment, sir.
Yeah, cheers, Michael. I just wanted to speak about the elephant in the room, really. I'm just wondering what your opinion is of the looming civil war in the SSC regions, which are currently obviously saying they're breaking away from Somaliland. I know there seems to be a lot of blame being thrown about, be it China, be it Ethiopia, be it Somalia, be it Puntland. But when are the political elite in Somaliland going to take responsibility and realise Somaliland was based on a social contract between different clans? We can all see this is disintegrated heavily quite recently.
I'm not sure how that can be rectified without sort of people getting in between. Another thing is, what do you think about Somaliland targeting innocent civilians in infrastructure like mosques and hospitals? Quite recently, they targeted the water facility in Asanad. And how does that ultimately impact its quest for recognition, or is that not even on the table at this point?
That's not actually true, Grad. That's absolutely false accusation, and there is no evidence that Somaliland killed civilians, and that's absolutely pure propaganda to the highest level. Somaliland military was told not to attack anyone. They have been told to stay their barricades. They were under attack since the beginning. So, and to say Somaliland killed civilians is really false allegation, and there is no proof of that at all. That's the war was instigated by the Al Shabaab, SSC militant groups who are actually trying to destroy and destabilize the only democratic country in the Horn of Africa, which is Somaliland. So Somaliland government doing everything it can to actually to help and save the civilians, and Somaliland military are not firing one bullet to civilians. So that's pure propaganda, and you need to take back that accusation, which is not which is false.
It's not propaganda. I'm actually from Las Anod myself. You know, I have family that have currently been, you know, they're away from their house. I have family members that died. I have family.
Garad, I apologize. I don't want to go back and forth with you. The topic for today, we're talking about the geopolitics of Somaliland. We're not talking about the crisis. But anyways, as geopolitics already mentioned...
Yeah, I was just wondering how that relates to the future of...
I'll get to that. I will get to that. I'll answer that for you. So just be patient with me.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, all right. So, yeah. So, first of all, as geopolitics rightfully said, there is no evidence for that. So this whole situation with the incursions and the civil unrest that's been caused, Michael, as I told you, we are facing from Somalia. We've got Somalian soldiers on the ground. We've got their evidence. We've got their rank. We've got their details. They're under investigation. And what's happened is there is a active campaign of misinformation and disinformation being taken place. There's this claim of like a genocide taking place, and there's no evidence for that. None of this is there, but there are people claiming, if anything, the genocide that is taking place is being claimed by people who have committed genocide. You know, we had one young gentleman here who I'm guessing his parents or grandparents kind of told him this kind of stuff. So again, I'm not going to be talking about Las Anod. There's something else that we can talk about. There are other spaces. So please, let's focus on the topic. We are talking about geopolitics, Somaliland, the Horn of Africa.
No, that's fine. If it's an echo chamber, that's fine. But I'm actually from that region. If you wanted a different opinion, I could maybe shed some light on certain things that you didn't know.
That's fine, Garad. I'm the one that's been interviewed here. I don't need your opinion, with all due respect, but thank you for that. I'll give it back to Michael. So we are focusing on geopolitics, Somaliland, the Horn of Africa. We've discussed the sovereignty and things of that nature, but that's not something that
Thank you. I just want to say to the Grad, I am also from Seoul region, so we are actually talking the same country. So don't think we know what we are talking about. I am from Seoul region, which is Las Anod, where you say is actually part of that region, which is called Seoul. So we are from there as well. Thank you.
Thank you, geopolitics. Back to you, Michael.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And just so you know, thanks for your question, Garan. Let's use less of the laughing emojis, guys. I do want to have civil discourse again. So one side might have an opinion. It might not be correct. It might be correct, but I don't want to have this blow up into something that it's not warranted. So again, let's just have engagement on a civil discussion here. And thanks, Garad, for your question. Again, if you have another question, I'd be happy to take it. But the next speaker I had was Mustafa Ahmed. And then after him, I have Ina Adiyar. So go ahead, Mustafa Ahmed, with your question, sir, or comment.
Hey, how are you? It's the question I have is based on economic. Um, a while ago, I remember there was a ship stuck on the Red Sea, and it cost the U.S. economy $9 billion a day. Somaliland takes great pride in securing the Red Sea, whether it comes to terrorism, whether it comes to pirates. Um, I don't think the U.S. economy realizes how much effect or direct effect it has on their goods. Everything that comes from China comes through the Red Sea, comes through right in our ports, and if one ship that gets stuck there costs the U.S. economy, especially nowadays with the inflation, right? Because I live in North America, so I'm in tune to what's going on and how it's a pinch on families that are the middle class families and the economical families that are coming up. Um, if one ship that got stuck in there cost the American economy $9 billion. Does the American economy understand that if piracy and terrorism, right? If Somaliland one day says, you know what, we're gonna back up and see what happens, and just washes their hand off, do they have any idea what impact that piracy and terrorism will have on the American economic from far away? That's my first question.
Yeah, I think that we do have an impact, and that Suez Canal container ship also. I don't know if that's the same one you're talking about, or if it's a different ship that also had a big and actually a huge effect on the world economy, not to mention America's economy. So part and parcel with that is our work with, I'm sure, Somaliland and the folks in Djibouti to do maritime aviation with drones and with other assets that we have in the region to search out for, pirates on the seas. It was actually a joint task force that I want to say ended in 2000. What was it? 14th, I think it was Joint Task Force Horn of Africa. That you can look up, and I want to look that up, but I don't want to take forever up and have a pause and get the stat. But maybe I'll come back and circle back with the correct stat. Or Abdul, if you want to look that up, or if you know anything about that. I believe it ended, I think, the mid 2010s. But I was a part of that on the USS Boxer over there, where we did sea control, pirate deterrence. Also, we helped a lot of refugees that were fleeing up from the Horn of Africa to try to go up to northern Africa and then into Europe eventually at the time. And so we had a lot of dinghies, a lot of boats, a lot of small fishing vessels that had a lot of refugees on them, as well as identification of certain vessels that may be Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda or other terrorist affiliated groups that might have an affiliation with those. We were supposed to ID those and to deter those and arrest or take out some of those people that would try to hijack ships over there, as well as a whole plethora of other nefarious activities that they wanted to do. To your main point of, partnership, I think we need to do a better job. I do think the stats on violence have gone down, the stats on hijacking ever since the task force was established back, what was it, 2009, 10, something. Right? It was after the Captain Phillips. Yeah, 2010, because it was definitely after the Captain Phillips episode in history, which actually USS Boxer played a key on. I actually worked out of the room that the admiral, the female admiral, took charge of the whole incident there. Although I was on the ship well after. I was on the ship from 2015 to 16, so I was on there after that whole situation had played out. And I believe the hijacking is dropped 90%. Not quite sure the stat, but it was between 80 and 90% since that task force was formed. And China actually was a part of that task force, and they actually used it to their advantage to create their base over, I think, not even 10 miles from Luminier. And so, as we see the rise of great power competition. We also see the rise of the importance of areas and countries like Somaliland and how they play a part in the stabilization of certain areas. Because without vital input from them, you could see a Mad Max type situation, hijackings on the seas, hijackings on land, exponential rise in terrorism in the region. You already see groups like Al Shabaab, but you also see the rise of groups in Central Asia, ISIS Khorasan, which wants to supplant the Taliban as the strongest fighter group in that region. And they also have tentacles in East Africa. And so you definitely don't want to see, a similar situation that played out from the mid 2010s with the rise of ISIS in Iraq. You don't want to have that replicated in East Africa. 100%, you don't want to have that replicated. Abdul, let me turn it over to you for an answer to Mustafa's point about maritime and regional security and how Somaliland is a partner in that effort.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Thank you for that question, Mustafa, as well. So yeah, I think I think we said it before earlier on. We've been here for a while that Somaliland spends a huge portion of its budget, its annual budget, on security and peace and stability in the region, and a large chunk of Somaliland's GDP, budget really goes towards, I think, 50% maybe, goes towards securing the Somaliland from ISIS and Al Shabaab and terrorism incidences and individuals, but also it secures the maritime region as well, the Red Sea and of the Gulf of Aden, and that comes at a huge cost as well. And that's, again, if you spend 50 to 60% of your budget on security, whereas the other budget that you need for development, for progress, for education, for health, and Somaliland is kind of struggling and suffering as a result on a number of these key indicators, purely as a function of being neglected by the international community. And we're doing a job for the international community, by the way, the world, by securing that very important and strategic, trade route. That trade route, very important, as we've already said. So Somalia spends a lot of budget, of its meager budget, on trying to secure both the maritime, offshore and onshore. And we've been doing that for long, and we will always do that. You know what I mean? Because we can't have ships getting hijacked and piracy and extending from the mainland Somalia to the other regions as well. And that's why the U.S. NAV force is on the EU NAV force is in the Horn of Africa, as well as other maritime joint efforts as well. But yeah, just want to say, Michael, I'll give back to you. I've got a couple of more questions. Maybe we can just finish up and then maybe close up if that's okay with you.
No, that's fine. I just DM'd you that actual response there. We're going to wrap it up here after the next three or so. But Mustafa, just go ahead. You said you had another question for us. And then
Yeah,
after
I'll
that,
keep
I'll
it
give
short.
it to the next two. Please go ahead with your second question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'll keep it short. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. The other one, the one thing I have a problem is there's a so-called arms embargo. I call it so-called because I don't think it's real. You have other country on Somalia, actually, arms embargo on Somalia. You have countries that are literally feeding Somalia and Al Shabaab money and weapons. You got China, you got Turkey, you got Qatar, but it seems that the other day the U.S. even shipped out a C-131 with $9 million worth of weapons so they can fight Al Shabaab. What I don't understand is, when will the U.S. wake up and realize that the same weapons that they're giving to these Somalians are the same weapons that are ending up in the hands of Al Shabaab that they're fighting themselves, and eventually are also, trickling down to the neighboring countries. To one of the reasons why they're getting funding, like I never seen a terrorist group more equipped, more money than a selected government, because they're not elected, right? It's a selected government, and they only control 4 kilometers. They don't even control their city, but Al Shabaab roams there, collects taxes, yet the Americans just send them an entire plane worth of weapons, $9 million worth of weapons. And then the same weapons were recovered by the Somaliland army fighting Al Shabaab and the terrorists and the militias. So how do you defeat an enemy that you keep feeding weapons, and and there's nothing going on about in terms of financial you know chokehold on these Al Shabaab, because right in North America you have people actually fundraising and sending them money and no questions asked. Like, that's kind of ironic. Like, you know what I mean? It doesn't make sense.
It's a fair point. It kind of reminds me of Syria, the whole spider web chart of different groups that were fighting against Bashar and we were supporting, and then groups that turned against us. And you also had ISIS and other groups. It's the whole, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there's a whole spider web chart of interconnecting lines in different groups. So this was kind of reminds me of, no, I think we do need to get a better track on that. And I don't know if we would ever directly send arms to Somaliland proper, unless we recognize them. There's probably some legalese behind that and doing that. So that's why we send directly to Somalia and not to Somaliland, if I had to guess. And that would be a Department of State boondoggle if I had to really put money on it. But let me turn it over to Abdul. And just quickly, I want to end it probably by 4 o'clock. We've gone a little bit longer than I anticipated, but we've got some great content that we've discussed, so I don't mind it at all. And then after your question, I'll wrap it up with Mustafa Mose and Ina Adiyar for our last two speakers. But go ahead, Abdul, and see if we can take a stab at the question. I do want to say it's related to DOS chicanery.
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing that you mentioned, that spider's web in Syria. So it's not a new thing. It's a crazy web. So basically, yeah, I think what Mustafa is referring to. So last month in January, there was a shipment of $9 million worth of weapons that was given out by the previous or the outgoing U.S. ambassador sitting in Mogadishu, Larry Andre. And the irony was, the story was, and this was in January, this wasn't 6 months ago or whatever. The irony was that a lot of those weapons went missing. And the word on the street, so to speak, is like it's just gone in the hands of nefarious characters, Al Shabaab, and the things of that nature. And so they don't have proper ways of accounting and whatever. So, but that's just the nature, unfortunately, of the beast. But the reason why it's a problem now, though, as opposed to before, say last year, before December, is now what it's doing is, because we have this infiltration of Somalian soldiers and the Somalian government to kind of undermine this US-Somaliland relationship. What is happening is there was even a shipment last month in February again that was also given out from Mogadishu airport, and it's ending up, these weapons are ending up with their soldiers, right, in Somaliland, right, and so that's what's happening. And I think Geopolitics mentioned earlier on that the Somaliland government and the army has been told to kind of don't use your force too much, just be restrained, and it's been following the orders of the international community. But to what extent? Once you have international incursions into your territorial integrity, it is duly the right, according to international law and just basic human rights, that if your house is broken into, you must defend it. And so Somaliland's territory has been infiltrated by our neighboring country, Somalia, predominantly, and some of the other nefarious actors. And we've got them in their video documentation and things of that nature. So it is a big problem that, a shipment in January and then another shipment in February, and they're being used to further the conflict in the Horn of Africa, well, in Somaliland specifically. And it's a big problem. It's a big problem. It's frustrating. But as you rightfully said, it is coming from the US State Department. Because Somaliland's not recognized, it has to work directly. I think they've got this ambassador through Mogadishu, but the current ambassador, this Larry Andre, the outgoing ambassador in Mogadishu, is not been really good for US interests. He's really been undermining Somaliland US interests and US interests as well, and really been like playing to Somalia side and things of that nature. So he hasn't been an honest broker, and that's why he's kind of been like reports are out now that he's retired. I think he said that's the reports, and they've brought in a new guy called Tim Trenkel, who is a very seasoned diplomat. He looks like he's done tours in Africa and Asia, but also he was based in Soccer. What's the name? Is it Soccercom in Germany? Not the US, the African command. There's a command, US command in Germany.
Stuttgart, Germany.
That's the one, Stuttgart. Yeah, there's a U.S. command based there in Stuttgart. He was based there for a while, worked in the U.S. Department, assistant under the Bureau of African Affairs in the U.S. State Department as well. And now he's coming to kind of, so he looks like he's a more trained diplomat, and he would be able to deal with this Somalia issue as needs be, as opposed to his predecessor, Larry Andre. But yeah, so it's problematic because a lot of the weapons, and not only that, we're also dealing with the illegal smuggling of weapons that is coming in from Iran through Yemen into the Bosasa port, right? The U.S. Treasury just recently, the end of last year, named the 10 individuals, by name and their tribe and their sub-tribe, and it's on the U.S. State Department Treasury website, that are responsible, these 10 individuals or a dozen so individuals, that are responsible for the funneling of illegal weapons and counterfeit goods into Somalia. And that's a problem because while Somalia is under a UN arms embargo, it's still getting weapons from Iran through Yemen, all right, into Bosasa, northern Somalia. And according to the UN reports, that is where the epicenter is of terrorism and financing and illegal weapon smuggling. It's happening from there, and it's ending up, some of those weapons, not only today in Somaliland, but it's also ending up in Ethiopia and fueling the conflict with the Amharas and the Oromia that is taking place, and also between the Tigrais as well. So it's problematic. It's fueling the conflict with the Al-Shabaab in Kenya as well. So it's a big problem for us, but it is what it is. But yeah, this U.S. needs to get a grasp of the situation. And once Somaliland is politically and legally severed from this kind of political mess, and already the precedent has been made, given that Ethiopia has recognized informally Somaliland by upgrading its representative in Hargeisa, capital city of Somaliland, to a full-fledged ambassador status, and vice versa, we've done the same, means that, the Americans are not going to be doing anything new, or the Israelis or the British now, because that's all they ever said. At least the British said, well, if somebody recognizes you, one of your neighbors or your localities, and whatever, then we'll be happy. You know what I mean? And so the precedent's already been there. And so to minimize this spread of this conflict and this kind of, instability in the region, recognition of Somaliland, it will be a prime pillar to kind of like reduce this problem, because then you will have a territorial integrity. Its borders will be, the borders are defined. It's the same borders, as I said to you, in 1960 that we have today, right? 26th of June, 1960. It's the same borders. And so what it will say is that, but even without recognition, Somaliland has the right, according to international law and Geneva Conventions and human rights law, to defend itself against actors, foreign actors, and non foreign state actors as well. It has the right. It's responsible for itself, for the peace and the stability of its people and its safety, and that's something that will be dealt with. But unfortunately, we are in a very unstable part of the world, so things are going to get a bit more messy before they get any better. But for sure, Somaliland has been good. So let's move on to the next questions. Michael, back to you.
Okay, thanks for that. And the next question is for Mustafa Mose, or Mustafa Mose, I'm not sure how you pronounce the last part. And but I do take in mind, everybody, I do have to end this at 4. What I am thinking of doing is later on this week, because I have a week off for my current job. I work at a military academy, and I have the cadets on leave this week. I might want to do a part 2. I'd like to do a part 2 if you didn't get your question answered today. And Abdul is just a wealth of knowledge that I've had previous guests on to speak on their topics of expertise, but for this particular issue, Somalia and East Africa, he's just, he had Dr. AQ. I don't know why he switched it to Mr. He should be a doctor. You have a PhD level of expertise. So I do want to, if you're open to it, Abdul, have a part 2 for folks that can't get their question answered today in the next 8 minutes, if that's something you're interested in.
No, for sure. I'd be happy to do a part 2 with you, and also to do a separate space on our channel as well, Michael, with you, and, things that you can discuss about your military backgrounds, not sensitive information, but, things that we can discuss, whether it's politics, geopolitics, America, and things of that nature. So I'd be more than happy to do that in the future.
Absolutely, and we can talk offline via DM about that, and I'd be happy to come on your show. See if we can do a lightning round the next 8 minutes to finish out. Go ahead, Mustafa Mose, with your question, please.
Hey, thank you, Michael. I really appreciate it. And I also appreciate your service for Navy. I worked with the Navy almost 6 years. I was attached to the Team 6. We deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, and I'm currently supporting them in the warfare against the terrorism.
Okay, and my question to you: the State Department sponsored and the State Department labeled anyone who sponsored a terrorist. We still have on the list Cuba, Iran, and Syria. I'm wondering how Somalia escaped because Somalia, and we only heard about the Black Hawks down, and not only one, and Al Shabaab have the foothold. Al Shabaab before that was the group they call Hakima, and before that was a Siad Barre, and who's collecting a weapon just like Saddam Hussein, a weapon of mass destruction. And after he left, those weapons went to the hand of the wrong people. Over 3 million dead. Somaliland has been attacked and bombarded by the foreign pilots. Somalia, since that, they hijacked 178 fuel or food or logistic ships. Iran, it never done that. Cuba, it never done that. And Syria, it never done that. Syria have an internal war inside, and you talked about that earlier. 778, and the weapon they cash in, the money they take from those boats is 1.5 billion. That money went to the wrong hand. That's how they built Al Shabaab. U.S. 3 months ago, they labeled a sanction for 10 people, all from Somalia, cashing weapons. They're all from the south of Somalia, and the federal state they call a Puntland, who's attacking now in Somaliland. So why Somalia was not a label state sponsored by Al Shabaab when they're attacking their neighbors? Kenya killing millions, hotel killing American. Went to Ethiopia August 5th, 2022, and killing over 400 people. And now have a foothold in Somalia, send it to Somaliland, and now they're in Las Anod. What's going on in the United States? What they blindsided this state-sponsored terrorists, and one of the ministers who was his head $5 million, Robo, now he's the religious minister in Somalia. What's going on?
Abdul, do you want to take that in the next 5 minutes, and then we have to end it?
Yeah. We chased Bin Laden. We chased Bin Laden because he was responsible. We wanted to Tora Bora. We chased Bin Laden because he was responsible for September 11 to kill our people, over 4,000 people. But these people are fishing, killing American everywhere they see. They are killing civilian. They committing a crime against the human. They've been killing people since 1990. Why we don't label it? Thank you.
I agree with that. I think we should go after him. But again, like I said earlier, I think we just have so much focus on Ukraine right now that we've taken our eye off the ball from a regional perspective in Africa and other areas. And also trying to wrap up the global war on terror to focus more on great power competition, that I think we've relegated these to second, third, and even fourth order, maybe even fifth order status. Abdul, since you have probably a lot more knowledge about the particular incidences about the hotels and other things, that can you take this, and then we have to end it in the next 4 minutes?
Yeah, no, I haven't got much to say on that, to be fair. Yeah, it's a worthy question by Mustafa. Thank you, Mustafa, for that. Why is not Somalia not on this list? It should be on this list, and it's a very pertinent question, given that Somalia has been on, since 91, a UN arms embargo. Somalia is not allowed to bring weapons and whatever of any sort. Despite that, the US Treasury and the State Department is fully aware of the illegal arms smuggling, and the UN and other international organizations are not unknown to the what's going on in Somalia and whatever. So there could be a number of reasons why they've taken them off the list. It could be the fact, potentially, again, this is just my opinion, but maybe now it's coming to 13 years since federal government of Somalia has been created, this entity, right? And so it's coming to the end of that program and that project, and the ATMIS, soldiers, 40,000 or so soldiers that are there to protect the peacekeeping soldiers from all over the world, are going to be finalizing their project, I think, in 2024. So things are kind of being rushed, and so that's what happens when you rush things. You make political, poor decisions, and it could come back to bite you on the bum potentially. For sure. So yeah, we just discussed earlier on why weapons coming from the USA, through the State Department, ends up in Al-Shabaab as recent as January and February last month, with huge millions of dollars of worth of weapons shipment. Nothing fancy, to be fair, but still. But they're getting illegal and more sophisticated weapons, though, illegally smuggled through, as I said, through the Bosaso port. It's a big problem. It's a question that's worth answering. And that's a question for the legislators and for State Department to kind of figure out, and the executive and the Department of Defense, what's going on here. Why have we taken off Somalia? I'm sure they know about it. It's not that they don't know. I don't think they're unaware. They know full well. The US has drones that fly over Somalia and Somaliland, from Djibouti and other regions. They're fully aware there's a EU naval task force on the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. So they know what's going on, and everybody's aware. The question is, how do you deal with it? And Somalia has been a big problem and a thorn in the side of the international community for over 30 years now, and even prior to that as well. Even during the days of the Somali Republic, Somalia was nothing more than just a terrorist, fascist, illegal state that used the weapons, $400 million worth of weapons, annual contract, to kill the Isaac genocide. That's what Siad Barre did. Siad Barre used nearly $500 million worth of government funds, to fuel up the army and the defense and the weaponry of the Somali Republic government. And who did he use that against? He didn't use it against the Kenyans. He didn't use it against the Ethiopians. He used it against the Somalilanders, the Isaac clan specifically, the genocide. So we are very concerned as Somalilanders, as a neighboring country, just as are Kenya and Ethiopia, when this arms embargo will be lifted, if it will be lifted on the Somalia. There is another, I think, UN Security Council meeting happening towards the end of this year in November. Every year now they're having a meeting, and so they're extending it now by yearly, as opposed to before where it used to be, I think, 3 years or 6 years or 5 years. So it's like Americans and the international community and the international organizations are kind of like saying we are kind of timed out. Sorry.
I think you're.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think your mic dropped off.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, that's what I was saying. That everybody's aware of what's going on. The question is, they're trying to expedite the process of trying to get Somalia on its own feet, withdraw these peacekeeping soldiers, international peacekeeping soldiers, and Somalia has to manage itself. But as I think some of the other speakers already said, Somalia is in no way to manage its affairs. It's not even close to it, and it will be a political disaster for it to be like that. So I don't know what the solution is. We'll have to wait and see what the EU, the UN, the USA, all the other international partners and organizations do about Somalia. But yeah, it's a big problem and a concern for us specifically. If especially this arms embargo is to be lifted, we know what will happen, and it will be a big problem. So yeah, let's see. Keep an eye on this. Back to you.
Yeah, I agree with that. And the other thing, just thinking about Abdul's response, and then just thinking in my brain, like, okay, just looking at things that we've done in the past, it might have been a hedge, a geopolitical hedge that the Department of Defense agreed with State on, and say, hey, if we don't sell these weapons, then Russia or China definitely will, with AKs or the other, I forget the nomenclature, Chinese. They're not very good, but they have a lot of machine guns that they're ready, willing, and able to sell to Somalia if we don't. So it goes back to the old, I hate to use the movie Lord of War as an example, but if we don't do it, then somebody else will, and they'll probably triple or quadruple or maybe even more in terms of the amount that goes into Somalia, which ultimately could be used against Somalilanders. And so that might be a geopolitical hedge. Sell them this, let them be satisfied with that, because if they don't get that, then they'll reach out to other more nefarious actors, geopolitically speaking. But with that said, I need to end my show. But what I want to do, and I haven't really done this, I did it before with a show on Transnistria, which is a very pressing thing, because that might also play into effect this year with this relations with Moldova and Romania and others, particularly as it relates to the Ukraine war. But I did a two-parter there. I like to do a two-parter for this. Again, if you're okay with it, please like my channel on YouTube. Subscribe to that. It's at Flashpoint Geopolitics, and it's linked on my Twitter account. Go ahead and follow me on Twitter. And what I'll do is I'll put out an announcement pretty soon with a part 2 or round 2, if you will, of this show talking about Somaliland. And I'd like to have on Ina, Sakad, Ali, and any other people here that that requested, but I wasn't able to get to. I'd like to have you back on that part 2 show to talk about Somaliland and some other issues that we didn't get a chance to discuss today. So with that said, I want to thank everybody that came out today to talk and ask questions, raise comments and concerns about Somaliland. And I look forward to doing a part 2 on this. We're not quite done yet talking about Somaliland. I think there's a whole litany of things that we could talk about, and hopefully end that part 2 talking about ways we can get full recognition